The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 45 Death. As a doorway, welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, the space where we sit with what most people turn away from, and where silence usually covers what needs to be spoken. In our last episode, we stood at the edge of madness and genius, exploring how brilliance and breakdown often share the same fire. Today, we step toward an edge that none of us can escape: death. Death is the doorway we all must walk through. Yet we live in a culture that hides it in hospitals, sterilizes it in statistics, or distracts from it with noise. But if you listen closely, death is not only an end, it's also a teacher. Myths, religions, and philosophies have long seen death as a threshold, a passage, or even a rebirth. Near-death experiences, ancestral traditions, and meditations on impermanence all point to the same truth. Remembering death transforms how we live. This conversation is not about morbidity. It's about clarity, presence, and what becomes possible when we let mortality into the room. We'll move through personal encounters with loss and survival, the psychology of terror and transcendence, and the ancient practices that teach us to carry death as a companion rather than a terror. Because when death is seen not as an enemy, but as a doorway, life itself takes on a new shape. So let's begin. The shadow we avoid every culture develops ways to sidestep death. We distract, euphemize, or ritualize it, wrapping mortality in layers of denial. Yet beneath those strategies lies a simple fact: death is the one experience every human being will face. The irony is that by avoiding its presence, we allow its shadow to rule us more than its reality ever could. Attributes: denial, the impulse to look away, to pretend it belongs only to others. Fear, the silent current that shapes choices more than we admit. Projection, turning death into monsters, curses, or punishments. Taboo, the cultural rule that says we shouldn't speak of it too openly. Reckoning, the eventual return of the shadow when avoidance no longer holds. Themes: across societies, a spectrum of approaches to death is evident. In Western culture, we often hide it away in hospitals, sanitized and medicalized, making it a backstage event rather than a public reality. By contrast, in traditions like Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, death is invited into the center of life, a guest at the table rather than an intruder at the door. The social construction of death talk tells us who is allowed to grieve, who must remain stoic, and what counts as a good or bad death. Yet beneath all this theatre, the shadow remains, an unspoken anxiety that seeps into everything from politics to advertising. Personal reflection. When I think back to my first real awareness of death, it wasn't from a funeral or direct loss. It came through the television. In the late 1980s, AIDS dominated the news cycle. The way it was presented, dramatic headlines, public health warnings, and TV discussions, made it feel like an invisible death sentence. As a child, I remember feeling an undercurrent of fear, almost a paranoia, that death was always nearby. The contradictions I noticed in the world sharpened during this period. People spoke about life, growth, and the future, but on the screens, death was everywhere, faceless and indiscriminate. That fear planted in me a deeper curiosity. Why are we so afraid to name death when it is already shaping how we live? Psychological insight psychologists have long noted that our fear of death, when repressed, leaks out sideways. Ernest Becker, in The Denial of Death, argued that much of civilization is built as a defense against mortality through achievements, monuments, or the search for legacy. Terror management theory builds on this, showing that when people are reminded of death, they cling more tightly to cultural values, national identities, or religious symbols as a shield. Avoidance doesn't erase mortality anxiety, it amplifies it in disguised forms. For example, risk-taking behaviors, obsessive productivity, or even consumer culture can all be ways of pretending we're immortal. My early fear during the AIDS epidemic was a small-scale example of this. Death wasn't just biological, it was psychological, cultural, and ideological. Embodiment prompt: sit with the word death for 5 minutes. Say it aloud. Notice what happens in your body: tension, relaxation, numbness, curiosity. Which part of you avoids, and which part of you leans in? Seed to plant death isn't waiting at the end of life. It walks beside us, silently shaping our choices. To avoid it is to let it rule unconsciously. To face it, even briefly, is to reclaim a little more freedom. Death as doorway across cultures and centuries, death has rarely been treated as a simple stop. Instead, it has been imagined as a doorway, a passage into another realm, a transition into spirit, or a return to the great cycle. From the Tibetan Bardo Thodol, Book of the Dead, which guides the soul through intermediate states, to the Egyptian weighing of the heart, to the Christian promise of resurrection, death is pictured less as annihilation than as transformation. Even in philosophy, thinkers from Plato to Heidegger suggested that death reveals truth. Mortality itself is the ground upon which meaning stands. Passage, not the end attributes. Threshold, transition, mystery, rebirth, transcendence. Themes: reincarnation, ancestral traditions, near death experiences, liminality. When we see death as a doorway, several motifs surface. Threshold, death marks a crossing, not a collapse. It is the ultimate threshold where identity shifts into an unknown form. Transition. In Hinduism and Buddhism, reincarnation frames death as a movement into a new embodiment. The spirit is not ended but recycled, refined, or liberated. Mystery. Every tradition admits there is an unknowable element. What lies beyond remains veiled, yet the persistence of myth shows our refusal to accept nothingness. Rebirth. Death is often paired with fertility myths. Persephone in the underworld, Osiris resurrected, Christ rising. What dies returns. Transcendence. For mystics, death is not only physical but egoic, the dying of self as a gateway to union with something greater. Together, these show death not just as cessation, but as continuity through change. 3. Personal reflection. As a teenager, I used to spend long nights reading about how different cultures imagined what happens after death. Norse warriors imagined Valhalla, Egyptology, Buddhists spoke of rebirth, and Christians spoke of heaven. Each was different, but all insisted, death is not the end. Later, when my grandfather passed, those stories became more than abstract. The funeral felt like its own threshold. The rhythm of ritual slowed time, and the grief carried us all into a liminal space, between what was and what now must be. In that space, I realized something. Death reshapes the living just as much as the dying. It forces us across thresholds we didn't choose, and yet it reminds us we, too, are travelers on the way to the doorway. Psychological insight psychology and anthropology both recognize that how we imagine death, as a doorway or dead end, deeply shapes resilience, grief, and meaning. Terror management theory, TMT, developed by Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pszczynski, TMT argues that humans create cultural worldviews, religions, myths, and philosophies to buffer mortality anxiety. If death is a doorway, not erasure, people live with more courage and less fear. Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death, 1973, Becker suggested that all of civilization is an immortality project. Whether through art, legacy, or afterlife belief, humans reach for continuity. By casting death as a passage, cultures give us tools to confront the unbearable with meaning. Brief psychology. Psychologist William Worden argued that healthy mourning isn't about moving on, but about continuing bonds. This idea reflects the doorway metaphor that relationships don't end at death, but transition into a new form of presence. In many cultures, ancestors are not gone but accessible, guiding the living. Near death experiences, NDEs. Bruce Grayson's research found that people reporting NDEs often describe liminal imagery, tunnels, lights, and presence, strikingly consistent across cultures. More importantly, NDEs reshape life. Those who return often report less materialism, more compassion, and less fear of death. Death as a doorway changes not only how they see the end, but how they live the present. Liminality, Victor Turner. In anthropology, liminal spaces dissolve old identity to prepare for new. Death is the ultimate liminal threshold, but so too are funerals, grief rituals, and memorials. These practices stabilize the living by framing death as a transition, not a rupture. When my cousin narrowly survived a serious accident, what struck me wasn't only his recovery, but how the event reshaped everyone around him. Conversations became deeper, priorities sharpened. The brush with death felt like it opened a doorway not just for him, but for all of us, a reminder that mortality is a teacher, and its lessons ripple far beyond the one who nearly crossed. Embodiment prompt or practice. Sit quietly and imagine death not as an end, but as a threshold. Ask, if death is a doorway, what am I stepping toward? Reflect on which stories, ancestral, religious, or personal, you lean on when you imagine this passage. Write down one fear you hold about death, and then rewrite it as if it were not an ending, but a transition. Integration moment. When death is imagined as a doorway, it ceases to be only terror and becomes mystery. Whether we lean on reincarnation, ancestral guidance, or symbolic renewal, this vision of death reframes life itself. It tells us that endings are not erasures, but passages. Liminal states where something dissolves so that something else can emerge. This shift not only comforts the grieving, but also empowers the living, reminding us that all thresholds carry the possibility of transformation. Seed to plant tonight. As you reflect, ask yourself, if death is a doorway, what unfinished part of me is waiting to be carried through? The seed is this, to treat death not only as fate, but as metaphor. Each small ending in life, a role, a habit, a relationship, is practice for the great threshold. In every death, a passage. In every passage, a beginning. Near-death narratives. What happens when a person comes back from the edge? Near-death experiences, NDEs, have been reported across cultures and eras, and they often follow strangely similar patterns. The tunnel, the light, the life review, the sense of detachment, the overwhelming feeling of peace. For those who return, the memory can be more vivid than waking life, reshaping values, dissolving fear, and opening new ways of living. The brink and the return attributes: vision, return, light, detachment, transformation. Themes: NDE research, altered consciousness, shifts in values and worldview. Themes and attributes near-death narratives stretch across medicine, mysticism, and myth. While the details vary, certain themes repeat with striking regularity. Vision and light. Many describe radiant light not as blinding, but as embracing, a presence rather than a glare. Whether seen as God, universal consciousness, or brain activity, it leaves a mark of awe. Detachment observation. People report floating above their bodies, watching resuscitation attempts unfold. For some, it's proof of a soul. For others, it's the brain's last trick. Life review. A common element is a panoramic replay of one's life, not just events, but their emotional impact on others. Those who report it often emerge with sharper moral clarity. Transformation on return. Perhaps the most important feature, those who survive often undergo profound shifts, losing fear of death, embracing gratitude, or abandoning material pursuits. These attributes map out a psychological and spiritual terrain that suggests death is not simply an end, but an altered state of consciousness in its own right. Personal reflection one winter. After heavy snowfall, I was driving down a stretch of road when the car hit black ice. In an instant, the tires lost grip, and I drifted into the right-hand lane, directly into the path of oncoming traffic. At 60 miles an hour, a head-on collision would have been fatal. I should never have been driving so fast in such conditions, a lesson learnt rather fast. I can still remember the frozen clarity of those seconds. No panic, no thought, just the raw awareness of being utterly out of control. By what felt like a flicker of grace, I managed to drift the car left, and the car slid back into the left lane just before headlights bore down on me. 5 or 10 seconds earlier, I would not be here to write these words. For days afterwards, I replayed it in my head, struck not only by the closeness of death, but by the strange calm that came with it. That brush with the edge didn't give me visions of light or tunnels, but it impressed on me how thin the veil is, and how quickly life can tilt into nothingness. It changed the way I approached risk, but also deepened my gratitude for ordinary days. Psychological insight psychologists and researchers have long wrestled with near-death experiences. Raymond Moody's Life After Life, 1975, popularized the study of NDEs, documenting recurring features across thousands of reports. Later, Bruce Greyson developed the Greyson scale, a tool still used to measure the depth and consistency of NDE accounts. From a neuroscientific perspective, explanations often point to oxygen deprivation, temporal lobe seizures, or surges of brain activity in moments of crisis. A 2013 study by Borjigin and colleagues, for example, found a burst of organized brain activity in rats just before death, suggesting the brain might flood itself with vivid consciousness as it shuts down. Yet biology alone doesn't explain the long-term transformation many survivors report. Studies consistently show NDE experiencers become less materialistic, more compassionate, and less afraid of death. Psychologist Kenneth Ring called this the after effect paradox. Whether or not an NDE reveals metaphysical truth, the lived impact is undeniably real. Here, the tension between psychology and spirituality is stark. Is the NDE a hallucination, or a glimpse of another dimension of reality? Either way, it functions as a threshold experience, reshaping lives in the same way other rites of passage do. Embodiment prompt or practice this week: explore the mini thresholds you encounter daily. Threshold noticing. Pay attention to the moments where you cross from one state to another: waking to sleeping, silence to noise, comfort to discomfort. How do they echo the larger transitions we fear? Life review exercise. Imagine if today were your last. Replay the last week of your life. What moments stand out? Where did you show kindness or miss it? Use this not to punish, but to recalibrate. Integration moment near-death narratives remind us that the boundary between living and dying is not solid, but porous. For those who've crossed and returned, the message is rarely about despair. It is about clarity, gratitude, and an urgency to live differently. Whether explained by neurons or the soul, the truth is the same. To brush against death is to wake up to life. Seed to plant tonight. Before sleep, pause and say quietly to yourself, if this were my last day, what unfinished love would I want to give? Carry that answer into tomorrow as a small act of presence. Mortality awareness in life. There's an old saying, you can't begin to live until you remember that you'll die. For most of us, death is something to avoid, a shadow tucked away in hospitals, funeral parlours, or whispered conversations. But across history, the most life-affirming philosophies and practices have done the opposite. They've carried death in the open, not as a curse, but as a guide. To live with mortality awareness is not to obsess over endings, it is to strip life of trivialities. When we know our days are numbered, the question shifts from how long can I stretch this to how deeply can I live this? How remembering death deepens life, attributes of mortality awareness clarity, a sharpened sense of what matters. Urgency, less time wasted in distraction or delay. Gratitude, ordinary moments suddenly glow. Presence, the future loses its tyranny. Humility, recognition of our shared fragility. Themes of mortality awareness, Theme 1. Lessons from hospice and palliative care. Modern palliative care teaches us what people regret and what they cherish when life nears its end. Atul Gawande, in Being Mortal, documents how patients facing death often care less about more time and more about quality of time. Love, dignity, autonomy, moments of connection. These stories remind us that mortality awareness isn't morbid, it's clarifying. Theme 2. Cross-cultural death practices. Where the modern West hides death, other cultures bring it into the light. In Mexico's Dia de los Muertos, families picnic in cemeteries, share food with the dead, and decorate altars with marigolds. Death is not separation, but continuity. In parts of Bhutan, it's said people contemplate death 5 times a day as a spiritual discipline, a daily grounding in impermanence. These practices teach us that integrating death into life fosters community, reverence, and joy. Theme 3. Contemporary mortality awareness movements. Death cafes now exist in cities worldwide, informal gatherings where people talk openly about dying over coffee and cake. Far from gloomy, these conversations often leave participants lighter, freer, more alive. Mortality awareness is becoming not only a spiritual practice, but a cultural movement, rehumanizing what medical systems and consumer culture have sterilized. Personal reflection. I remember being in my late teens and early 20s, when I spent long hours studying and living like a hermit, rarely going out with friends. At that age, I thought life would stretch on forever, that there would always be more time for connections, more chances to say yes. But looking back, I realize how quickly people drifted. One friend came by just before I left for university, wishing me well, disappointed that I wouldn't be around after. We never stopped being friends, but contact dissolved. It wasn't death in the literal sense, it was the death of a chapter. The kind you only notice when you look back and see that something is gone, permanently. That experience taught me something about mortality awareness. Death isn't only what happens at the end of life. It's in the little endings too, friendships that fade, opportunities missed, phases that never return. Remembering this makes me more present to the people in front of me now, because whether by years or circumstance, every connection has a limit. And when we live as if we'll have infinite chances, we miss the chance that's right here. Psychological insight psychologists often speak of mortality salience, the awareness of our own death. Terror management theory, Pinsky, Greenberg, Solomon, argues that reminders of mortality can provoke anxiety, leading people to cling more tightly to cultural worldviews, identities, or distractions that buffer against fear. But not all responses to mortality awareness are defensive. Research in existential psychology shows that when integrated, awareness of death enriches life. Irvin Yalom, an existential psychotherapist, found that patients who faced death directly often reported greater intimacy, reduced trivial anxieties, and a newfound appreciation of daily life. Instead of paralysis, mortality awareness sparked freedom. One study by psychologist Laura Blackie and colleagues, 2017, found that confronting mortality increased eudaimonic well-being, meaning purpose, authenticity. In other words, the closer people came to death awareness, the more they sought lives aligned with their deepest values. For me, the lesson is this: mortality awareness doesn't just strip away illusions, it recalibrates us. When I remember that time is finite, I stop postponing the things that matter. I say what needs to be said, create what needs to be created, love more openly, and waste less energy on resentment. Death, paradoxically, is a teacher of life. Embodiment prompt or practice. Try Memento Mori journal for 1 week. Each evening, write down one small thing you'd do differently if you knew your time was limited. Not grand resolutions, small lived shifts. A call to a friend, an apology made, a sunset watched instead of scrolled past. Notice how mortality awareness changes the shape of your choices. Integration moment death awareness isn't about gloom. It's about stripping away illusion. When we carry death close, we see life differently. The petty grievances shrink. The moments of connection matter more. The colours seem brighter, the silence is more profound. To live with mortality awareness is to let death walk beside you, not as a terror, but as a teacher. A reminder that time is the rarest resource, and the present is the only currency we truly have. Seed to plant tomorrow when you wake, remind yourself softly, this day will never come again. Let that awareness guide you into presence. Let it make you braver in love, sharper in focus, and freer in being. Personal encounters with death. For most of us, death is abstract, a statistic on the news, a ritual hidden behind closed doors. But abstraction collapses the moment it touches our own lives. A near miss on the road, a family member gone too soon, the sudden silence after laughter that once filled a room. These moments don't just remind us of mortality, they reconfigure who we are. Personal encounters with death carve deep fault lines in identity. They force us to see life not as an endless horizon, but as something fragile, fleeting, and irreplaceable. And yet, within that rupture lies a strange gift. Grief that reshapes values, fragility that births resilience, endings that plant seeds of transformation. When mortality becomes personal, attributes of encountering death, fragility, the undeniable truth that life can change in a breath, grief, the ache of loss that resists neat explanations, transformation, how mourning can reorder meaning, meaning making, the stories we create to live with absence, resilience, the unexpected strength that rises from breaking, themes, how grief and mortality awareness reshape identity, relationships, and our orientation to living. Fragility, to encounter death, is to feel the ground break beneath you, whether it's the sudden loss of someone close or narrowly avoiding your own end. Fragility brings the shocking awareness that life is less permanent than we pretend. Grief is not just sadness, it is a reorganization of reality. When someone dies, it's not only the person that disappears, it's the version of ourselves that existed with them. Grief forces us to navigate identity in their absence. Transformation, though searing, grief often plants new roots. Viktor Frankl wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that suffering, when met with courage, becomes a pathway to meaning. Loss may never be redeemed, but it can transform us into people who live with sharper presence and deeper compassion. Meaning-making humans instinctively create narratives around death. They're watching over me. This taught me what matters. These stories aren't denial, they're survival. They help us metabolize the incomprehensible and weave absence into belonging. Resilient psychological research shows that many people develop what's called post-traumatic growth after encounters with death, heightened appreciation of life, stronger relationships, and a clarified sense of purpose. The fracture doesn't disappear, but resilience grows in its cracks. Personal reflection. One of my closest brushes with death came on a winter road. I was driving after snowfall when my tires struck black ice. The car began to drift, sliding into the right lane, straight into the path of oncoming traffic. In that moment, time slowed. A cold clarity gripped me as headlights drew closer. After I regained control, I pulled over minutes later, my hands shook on the wheel. The road ahead looked the same, but I was not the same. The brush with death hadn't killed me, but it killed something else, the illusion of invulnerability. For weeks afterwards, and still to this day, thinking about how close I was, I noticed everything more vividly. The warmth of a shower, the chatter of friends, the comfort of simply waking up. That near miss became a doorway into gratitude. Psychological insight psychologists describe these experiences as mortality shocks, events that suddenly strip away denial and bring mortality into sharp focus. Unlike abstract reflection, mortality shocks force confrontation. This could have been the end. Research in trauma psychology highlights both the pain and the potential of such encounters. George Bonanno's work shows that grief and trauma responses are highly individual. Not everyone breaks, and not everyone recovers. What often emerges instead is a reshaping, a new baseline of meaning. Post-traumatic growth. Tedeschi and Calhoun, 1996, identifies 5 areas where encounters with death often shift lives: deeper appreciation of life, closer relationships, increased personal strength, recognition of new possibilities, spiritual or existential growth. These are not silver linings slapped on tragedy, they are the reforged structures people build when life collapses. My own black ice experience mirrors this research. For a time, I carried heightened vigilance, scanning roads, anticipating danger. But alongside fear came a sharpened appreciation. I didn't suddenly become fearless, but I became more aware. The fragility of life, once tasted, makes every ordinary moment extraordinary. Embodiment prompt or practice. Recall one encounter you've had with death, whether losing someone or a near miss of your own. Write down how it felt in the moment. Then write how it changed the way you lived afterwards. Notice both the fracture and the transformation. Integration moment encounters with death strip away illusions. They remind us that the line between living and leaving is thinner than we want to admit. But within that rupture lies a chance to love more openly, to speak what matters, to live awake rather than half asleep. Death may take, but it also teaches. It teaches us that the measure of life is not length, but depth. Seed to plant this week. Let the memory of loss or near miss remind you of life. Don't just recall the fear or grief, recall the clarity it gave you. Carry that clarity forward as a compass. Psychological insights. Death and the psyche every philosophy eventually collides with the same wall. We are finite. Psychology, unlike myth or religion, tries to map the mind's defense mechanisms against this truth. What does it mean to live with the awareness that one day we will cease to exist? What psychology tells us about mortality? Some people repress it, others wrestle with it, and a few let it shape the very core of their lives. Death is not just a biological event. It is a psychological horizon, the unspoken boundary that gives shape to how we live. Attributes anxiety, the tension that arises when mortality breaks through denial. Defense, the strategies we use to avoid or soften death awareness. Growth, the possibility of death awareness deepening life. Transcendence, glimpses of meaning beyond the individual self. Integration, carrying death as part of life rather than its opposite. Themes terror management theory, TMT, developed by Greenberg, Pinsky, and Solomon. This theory builds on Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death. It suggests that much of human behavior is motivated by the need to manage unconscious death anxiety. From cultural systems to religious beliefs, we create symbolic worlds to feel immortal. Defenses against death. Denial, distraction, legacy building, and clinging to belief systems are not just personal quirks but shared human strategies. Meaning making. Psychologists like Viktor Frankl argued that the confrontation with mortality, far from paralyzing, can ignite a deeper sense of purpose. Transformation through awareness. When people integrate mortality through near death experiences, grief, or contemplative practices, they often report heightened presence, gratitude, and courage. Personal reflection. I never encountered Ernest Becker's writing directly referenced before, but I met the same truths in subtler ways. My first fear of death wasn't philosophical but visceral. In the late 1980s, AIDS dominated the news. I remember watching television dramas that depicted young people wasting away, their bodies collapsing under the weight of an invisible virus. For the first time, I realized death wasn't some distant concept for the elderly. It could arrive suddenly, unfairly, and to people not much older than myself. That awareness unsettled me deeply. I'd lie awake, replaying those images, feeling a creeping fear that the world wasn't safe, that life itself was precarious. Looking back, those were my first encounters with mortality awareness, even if I couldn't articulate it. They shaped how cautious I was with my choices, how much I wanted control, and how a part of me carried that background hum of anxiety for years. Psychological insight death anxiety operates like an underground current. We rarely name it, but it seeps into decisions both small and large. Terror management theory proposes that everything from our need for self esteem to our allegiance to culture is a buffer against this fear. By identifying with something enduring, a religion, a nation, even a personal legacy, we borrow a sense of permanence. Yet psychology also recognizes the cost of denial. Suppressing mortality can lead to compulsive distraction or over attachment to symbols of security. Ernest Becker argued that societies build immortality projects, careers, achievements, even ideologies, to escape the inevitability of death. But these projects can become prisons, keeping us from actually living. On the other hand, research by Yalom and others in existential psychotherapy shows that facing mortality directly often leads to positive transformation, greater authenticity, deeper intimacy, and a more urgent pursuit of what truly matters. When I recall my fear as a teenager, I can see both sides of this. The fear drove me inward, into study, into control. But in hindsight, it also sharpened my appreciation for time. That anxiety about AIDS wasn't just dread, it was a lesson, pushing me to realize life is fragile and the moments we waste cannot be recovered. That realization, painful as it was, became a subtle teacher. Embodiment prompt or practice this week, try a Memento Mori practice. Choose a simple object, a candle, a stone, or even a watch. Each morning hold it and whisper, I too will die. Notice the emotions that arise, resistance, fear, calm, or clarity. The point is not to morbidly obsess, but to soften denial. With repetition, the phrase shifts from terror to tenderness, a reminder that life is limited and therefore precious. Seed to plant when death is denied, life becomes shallow. When death is faced, life deepens. Carry this seed. Mortality is not your enemy, but your companion. Walk with it, not as a shadow to fear, but as a quiet guide reminding you what matters. Living with the door open death is not just an ending, it is a presence that walks beside us. Most of us spend our lives trying to push it away, as if ignoring it will make it less inevitable. Yet those who learn to carry death as a companion often live with greater courage, tenderness, and truth. Living with the door open is about recognizing mortality not as a shadow to fear, but as a guide that shapes the choices we make while we still have time. Attributes courage, the willingness to face what we cannot control. Presence, a deeper attention to the ordinary moments of life. Freedom, lessening of trivial fears when death is accepted. Acceptance, releasing the illusion of permanence. Love, a heightened appreciation for relationships, knowing they are finite. Themes throughout history, spiritual traditions have urged us to keep death in view. The Stoic practice of Memento Mori reminded philosophers to savor the present, precisely because it cannot last. Buddhists meditate on impermanence, not to dwell in despair but to loosen attachment to ego and possessions. Modern psychology suggests that those who integrate mortality awareness tend to prioritize meaning, connection, and authenticity over status or distraction. When we live with death close at hand, we recalibrate what matters. Careers, possessions, and grudges fall into their proper proportion. What rises is often intimacy, expression, creativity, and gratitude. Personal reflection. For me, the awareness of mortality has not always been philosophical. It was sometimes visceral. I still remember the brush with death on a winter's road when my car hit black ice and skidded into the opposite lane. For a moment, I saw headlights rushing toward me, the possibility of everything ending in seconds. By instinct, I drifted the car back just in time, avoiding a head on collision. Afterwards, I sat in silence, hands gripping the wheel, realizing how thin the veil is between continuation and cessation. That moment, unplanned and unwanted, altered how I saw the days that followed. It wasn't about becoming reckless or living as if tomorrow would never come. It was subtler, a quiet reminder that the small moments could be final, and that I didn't want to live in ways I would regret if the end came suddenly. Psychological insight psychologists call this integration of death into everyday awareness mortality salience. Research shows that when death is brought to mind, people can respond in two very different ways. Some retreat into fear, denial, or distraction, reinforcing defenses to avoid thinking about it. Others, however, shift toward growth. They reevaluate priorities, deepen connections, and invest in what feels meaningful. Ernest Becker, in The Denial of Death, argued that much of human culture is built as a buffer against this anxiety, achievements, wealth, even ideologies are ways of denying our eventual disappearance. Yet when we confront this denial directly, the paradox emerges. Death awareness can make us more alive. Instead of shrinking from life, we begin to expand into it. This has echoed in my own life. After that black ice incident, I noticed myself worrying less about trivial embarrassments or small failures. The urgency of mortality reframed them as insignificant. What mattered was whether I spoke honestly, acted with integrity, and stayed close to those I loved. Embodiment practice. Sit quietly and place your hand over your heart. Breathe deeply, noticing the rhythm that keeps you alive without your control. Then visualize this heartbeat as finite, a series of beats with a beginning and an end. Instead of dread, invite gratitude for each one. Ask yourself, if this were my last day, what conversation, gesture, or expression of love would I not want to leave unsaid? Integration moment. Living with door open is not about dwelling in fear of death. It is about letting its inevitability dissolve the illusions that keep us from living fully. When we carry death close, we stop postponing our lives. We realize that perfection, certainty, and endless time are fantasies. What remains is the present moment, urgent and luminous. Seed to plant begin each day with the whisper, I will not live forever. Let me not waste this chance. Carry it with you into the mundane and the extraordinary alike. See how it changes the way you respond to the small irritations, the big decisions, and the fleeting chances to love. The doorway that teaches us to live death does not wait politely at the end of life. It whispers at the edges of every moment, reminding us that nothing is guaranteed. To treat it as an enemy is to live in fear. To welcome it as a teacher is to discover how fragile, luminous, and urgent life is. Mortality is not just a shadow to dread. It is the flame that makes each day precious. The final threshold teaches us that presence, gratitude, and love are not luxuries, they are necessities, because time is always running out. You've been listening to The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and remember, living with death at your side is not the end of freedom, it is the beginning of life. James Miller.